Can you all, first of all, can you all hear me? Good. And are you cool enough? No. Well, we're going to leave apart from the fact, we're going to leave the back door open so you can get the kind of a wee breeze coming in, which I hope will work and save us all from melting into an Edinburgh Saturday evening. Anyway, so welcome to you all. I'm very glad to see an absolutely full house here at the RSE itself, and also welcome to those who are joining us online. There are quite a lot of them as well. So we're thrilled to have you for this event as part of the Curious Festival of Knowledge. And this is the first of the kind of grand sort of sessions, as it were. Now, I'm David Gow. I'm a former Scotsman and Guardian correspondent editor, and I now chair inter alia the RSE's Scotland and Europe initiative about the post-Brexit policy landscape. So as you can tell, I'm very well suited to chairing this session on polar exploration. So Michael Smith, sitting in the front here, is about to speak, and I are old Guardian colleagues, which is how this event originated, effectively. We were put back in touch by a mutual friend, and I started voraciously reading about and watching films about polar exploration in all its guises and meanings. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Please note that the RSE's fire safety and evacuation procedure is to assemble outside the dome, which is out of the building to your right. I say outside the building in case you're tempted to go inside and stay there rather than come back here where the fire is declared non-event. Leaving the building the way you came in. So, the fire exits are shown here. And we're not expecting an alarm, so please follow the staff's instructions in the case of an evacuation. So we're all in for a fascinating event during which you'll have the chance to ask questions of our speakers. We won't do it during their presentations because we're going to have 3, so keep them ready for the Q&A. And if you're online, obviously put your questions as usual into the chat, and somebody here will read them out on your behalf, and we'll answer those. So, without further ado, please welcome to the stage our first speaker, author and journalist Michael Smith, or Mick, to me and others. Mick has transformed himself. He's morphed from a journalist writing about industry and politics to a specialist in the history of polar exploration who's written at least a dozen books and given many lectures on the topic. So we look forward to hearing from you, Mike, now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Thanks, and lovely to be here. Lovely to see a full house. It does seem highly inappropriate that we're here to talk about ice and snow, and you're all fanning yourselves because it's so hot. I was giving a talk actually about this subject near my hometown in the south of England, and in true English style, we had an overnight shower of snow, so a dusting, I suppose, is the word you'd use. And on the day I was due to go off and give this talk, the phone went at sort of 9 o'clock in the morning, and a breathless woman came on and said, "I'm really, really sorry, we're going to have to cancel." And I said, "Oh, what's the problem?" And she said, "It's the snow." And I said, "Do you realise the irony of what you're saying?" And the scary thing is she didn't, but we'll gloss over that. But yeah, I'm here in a sense to represent the history of polar exploration. I have no connections with modern day endeavours such as Luke. People say to me, "Have you ever been to the Antarctic?" The farthest south I've been is Nice. The wine is nicer there, let's face it. But I've written a lot, as David mentioned, I've written quite a lot about the subject, so I know the history quite well. And we talk about, when you mention to people what you do, mention polar exploration history, invariably the names that come up are Scot and Shackleton and Amundsen, if you know the subject well. And of course, with the Scots, very proud of Bruce and James Wordie, to name but 2 others. But it's a good, reasonable case to say you probably don't know an awful lot about this man, Tom Crean. And I think he is the heart of what we call the heroic age of polar exploration, which began around about 1895 and ended in 1922 with the death of Shackleton. So in that very short period, you have all these incredible adventures, the Scot and Shackleton adventure, Amundsen getting to the pole. All of these things happened in this very short period. Well, let's start by just putting this man into context for you. Tom Crean sailed on 3 of the 4 British expeditions during that period, or 4 major expeditions. Tom was on 3 of them. If you were a real nerd and counted up the days and the weeks and the years, he spent longer in the Antarctic than either Scott or Shackleton. It's almost certain you will know very little about him because he never kept a diary, he never wrote a book. In fact, when I did write a book about him, I discovered that he never gave a single interview in his life. And he never, ever spoke to anybody about what he had done. And I can't emphasize anyone because I know the family, and he didn't talk to his own children about what he'd done. So this is not a cliche. It sounds like it, but it's not a cliche. He literally took his story to the grave. So when he died, the story died with him. And people knew very little about him. So I'm going to run through it at 100 miles an hour and fill in a few gaps. And, obviously, when it comes to the Q's and A's, fire away. But there are good reasons why he didn't speak about his exploits. Start off, he's born in 1877 on the west coast of Ireland in Kerry, the nicest part of Ireland, in my view. Farmer's son, I think he was the 5th child, therefore he wasn't going to inherit the farm. And like thousands upon thousands of young Irish people in those days, his education was rudimentary, to say the least. He could read and write and not much else. And so he did what thousands of others did. He either joined the army or the navy. And there was a colossal input of youngsters who joined the navy. Where he came from in Kerry overlooks the Atlantic. So it was kind of a natural thing for him to do. No tradition of going into the sea. He does 8 years as an ordinary seaman in Queen Victoria's mighty navy. And he happened to be stationed on a ship in New Zealand, the port of Lyttelton in New Zealand, in 1901, when Discovery, which is the first major British expedition of this heroic age, was loading up for last supplies before going to the Antarctic. What happened, very simply, is that one of Scott's sailors got drunk, had a fight and deserted. Not the first sailor in history to do that, but this left a gap. And on the eve of sailing, Tom Crean volunteered to go. And then from that moment, he becomes this colossal figure with both Scott and Shackleton. And those of you who know much about it will know that Scott and Shackleton were not bosom buddies. They didn't get on very well, and very few people worked with either one or the other, not with both. He was very unusual. So he goes off to the Antarctic. Really, it's difficult to underestimate how little was known. You could say that people knew more about the moon than they did the Antarctic in 1901. The first recorded footprints on Antarctica are 1895. So this is 6 years later. There were landings before that, but they weren't recorded. And so off they go. And this is a very historic photograph because, believe it or not, this is the first attempt to reach the South Pole. They didn't get anywhere near it, but that's another story. But you can pick out Tom Crean in it, even though you can't clearly see the faces. And I'll just make sure I've got it's this man here. And how do we know that? Because he's carrying the British flag with the Irish harp. And one of the officers, who's also in the picture, obviously we can't pick who he is, wrote it in his diary that Tom Crean proudly marched to the South Pole carrying the Irish flag. And he was there now for 2 years. As I say, they didn't get anywhere near to the pole. But they made some huge scientific discoveries, and partly that was one of the reasons that William Speirs Bruce went to the Antarctica roughly the same time, but he was much more of a scientist. These guys were predominantly focused on exploration. When Scott went back to the Antarctic in 1910, he left the UK, one of the first men he recruited was Tom Crean. And he recruited him for all sorts of reasons. He wasn't just a big, strong Irish farm labourer. He had extraordinary mental resolve. You really could trust this man with your life, and lots of people did, and lots of people's lives were saved by it. He was an incredible character. It is worth emphasising in the context of what my colleague's going to be talking about a bit later. These men did virtually no training, no preparation. They sat around in the huts in the winter during the Antarctic, waiting to go off. And as you can see from this picture, they were all seamen. And in those days, if you were in the Royal Navy, which Tom was, you got cheap tobacco. So they all smoked like chimneys. So they did no training and smoked like chimneys and ate awful food. So it's quite remarkable. But this is a picture of great historic significance for those who don't know. This is the beginning of Scott's march to the South Pole, on which he subsequently died. And you'll have to take my word for it, there's 23 people in it. There's only one man smiling. Tom Crean, which sums up the Crean character. He was a man of supreme self-confidence. He knew how far to push himself. The others, understandably, are apprehensive. The South Pole, in very round terms now, I'm not being specific, in round terms, the South Pole is 900 miles away. And they're going to walk every step of the way. And when they get there, they're going to turn around and walk back. So you can only travel as far as the amount of food you can carry, which was the big equation, which in Scott's case, they got wrong. But you can see the sense of these men. Tom is in this photograph. We think that's him there. We don't obviously know. Believe it or not, there are 6 men pulling this sledge, as one is slightly out of the picture, you can't see. Uphill, 2 miles above sea level. The South Pole is 2 miles above sea level, so to get there, you have to adjust to altitude. Quite remarkable, really. And we have this wonderful, very lyrical moment on this. It's in some respects, it's quite funny. When they got to within 150 miles of the pole, Scott was left with 2 teams of 4, and the whole expedition had been built around groups of 4-man tents, 4-man sledges, 4-man food provisions. Everything was built around 4. And at 150 miles from the pole, he changed his plan, and he took 5 men. And he sent Tom Crean back. Now, this is not a talk about Scott's strengths and weaknesses, because I actually admire him in lots of respects, but he wasn't a great leader. And one of the things he hated was taking decisions. And he didn't like confrontation. Tom Crean had been with him loyally since the Discovery expedition. He couldn't bring himself to say that he's not going to the South Pole. So he was going to take 5 men to the pole, and Tom was going to go back with 2 other men. He looked for an excuse. And Tom, as I mentioned earlier, was a pipe smoker. And those of you who know a pipe smoker, they're always clearing their throat. It's kind of a natural thing to do. And he heard Tom was in a tent doing some cooking or something, task. Now remember, they're 150 miles from the pole. So, and he hears him coughing. And Scott sticks his head in the tent and says, "You have a bad cold there, Tom." And Crean saw through him. He knew exactly what he meant. And so he said, beautiful response, "I understand a half-sung song." And so he turned. Scott goes to the South Pole and dies, sadly. And for those who are interested in the details of this, how do they take the picture if there's 5 of them? They certainly didn't have selfies in those days. Henry Bowers has his glove off, and in his hand he has a piece of extremely old technology we call string. and that's attached to the camera. But what happened now, so the Scot story becomes a national tragedy. It's difficult to imagine in today's terms. The country came to a standstill when it was revealed that these men had died. They became national martyrs. But this completely overlooked what Tom Crean did. And one of the reasons why his story is underappreciated when you look at this period of history. Because he turns from when he says good farewell to Scott, he's actually in tears because he's so disappointed. He now has to walk 750 miles with two colleagues, both of whom are already played out. And that's why I believe Scott sent him back. He wanted the insurance of Tom's muscle power to help get these men back. So they go off. More or less, you're on a plateau that's 2 miles high. You come down the glacier, and then you come onto the Ross ice shelf, which is flat as a pancake. It's like being at sea. Well, it is sea, actually, except it's a lump of ice. The only one who could navigate was the officer in charge, Lieutenant Evans. And he got scurvy and collapsed. Now, I am encapsulating quite a long period here, but he collapsed with scurvy and was semi-comatose. And he ordered Tom and the other man to leave him behind to save themselves, and they refused an order. So they marched on and on and on, slowing to around about 4 to 5 miles a day, eating perhaps 50% of the calories they needed, seriously dehydrated. And in themselves, in the very early stages of scurvy, they thought Evans was dead at one point. And there's a lovely, rather touching moment when they thought Evans had died, and Tom bent over him in the tent to see if he could feel the man's breath on his cheek, and he couldn't feel any sensation. And he began to cry, and the tears woke him up. And he lived. But he only lived because when they got to within 35 miles, which is 54k from base camp, both Evans and the other man, Bill Lashley, were completely played out. Tom Crean was still standing. And so he decided to walk the last 35 miles alone. No tent, no sleeping bag. And he left Lashley to look after Evans, who was clearly dying, and he set off alone. The only food he had were 3 sticks of chocolate and 2 biscuits. And as I said, he didn't really write this down, so we only have very scraps of information. But there is one delightfully funny moment in this, if there is such a thing as fun in these moments, when he said he sat down to have his rations, i.e. sticks of chocolate and a couple of biscuits. And he ate the chocolate and one of the biscuits, and then he put the other biscuit in his pocket, as he put it, for emergencies. You think, Jesus, what else can go wrong? You know, a meteor strike, Boris Johnson back as Prime Minister. I mean, you name it. What's the worst thing you could imagine? But he puts the biscuit back in his pocket for emergencies because he was convinced he was going to get through. And he did. And he walked for 18 hours. Now, just a little bit of mathematics for you. When he finished his walk, he had done 35 miles extra on his own, but he'd already walked 1,500 miles. And 1,500 miles from Edinburgh would get you to Moscow. That's roughly how far he'd walked on half rations, in effect. And the first thing he did, first of all, he collapsed and had to be revived with a tot of brandy. I think the medical profession should bring this custom back, personally. With a tot of brandy, and he was promptly sick all over the poor old doctor. But he then volunteered to go back out and rescue the other 2 guys, which they wisely didn't allow. And of course, the sight of a hard nut like Tom Crean was the sign that Scott was in trouble. And so they waited for Scott to come in. And of course, he never did. But 8 months later, they went back out to look for the bodies, and they knew in rough terms where the bodies were, where the tracks of their path was. Sorry, not where the bodies were, but where the tracks were. And they found the bodies. And before the big decision was, should we bring them home or should we bury them? And it was decided to bury them where they fell, as though they were soldiers or sailors killed in battle. And Tom did something which is very Irish. The Irish in the room will recognise this. The idea was they took all their personal effects out of the tent, the famous Scot diaries and the photographs that I just showed, this one. They took these out of the tent, collapsed the tent on the bodies, built a cairn of snow, sang a few hymns and left them there. Tom went back into the tent before they collapsed it, and he did a very Irish thing. He kissed the head of the corpse as a mark of respect. And so he comes home and he gets the Albert Medal, which is the equivalent of the George Cross today for saving his life. Within less than a year after coming back, he's off with Shackleton. Here he is, here's Shackleton. He's second officer on Endurance. As you know, the ship's recently been found. Here it is. Into the Weddell Sea in 1915 and made only one journey. And this is just for the sentimental amongst you. It's a wonderful picture, the Beauty and the Beast. You decide which is which. But farmer's son, he was great with the animals. He actually understood the animals better than anybody else. I am racing through this because I'm conscious that I'm stealing other people's time. But they were on a floating lump of ice, roughly. And Tom and Shackleton and 4 other men sailed from Elephant Island to South Georgia. Then they walked across the mountains of South Georgia without shelter, no tent, no sleeping bags. And here he is. Here's Shackleton. And eventually they rescued the men. But we then come to, this is 1916. He comes back to the UK, straight into the Navy, into the First World War. Survives, fortunately. Goes back to his home village, at a place called Alnaskall in County Kerry. Gets married and has 3 kids, one of whom died when she was quite small. And this, I knew them both. This lady lived to be 99 and a half. She was a lovely woman, Mary. But Tom Crean came back to Ireland in March of 1920. This is a very significant date in Irish history because it's when the War of Independence was being ratcheted up. Any association with the British could get you shot. And I mean literally shot. So we're not just talking about soldiers and sailors. We're talking about Coast Guard officers, postmen, policemen, anyone wearing the uniform. Tom had been in the British Navy for 27 years. He was highly vulnerable. His older brother, Cornelius, was a policeman in the Royal Irish Constabulary. He was ambushed in Cork and shot dead a month after Tom came home. And so Tom Crean took, what I think is a very brave decision. He decided never to speak about his exploits. So he did not even speak to his family about them. And I know that because, as I said, I interviewed the girls. But he did open a pub. And I don't want to be responsible for sending you all off to the pub. I'm sure you'll need no encouragement at all. But this is the pub he bought, and it's still there today. And it's called the South Pole Inn. And this is a very important point, because although he could never speak about his time with Scot and Shackleton, he wanted people to know. And you will also know, the Irish in the room will know this, most pubs in Ireland are named after the owner. They're not called the George IV or the James II or whatever. They're called by the name of the owner. He chose to call it the South Pole Inn. It's still open because I was in it not long ago. And I would recommend, if you're ever in Ireland, you should go to the South Pole Inn. This is the last picture we have of Tom, and believe it or not, after all these exploits, 3 expeditions, as I said, spent longer there than either Scott or Shackleton. He died of a burst appendix. You couldn't make it up. But look at it. I hope you enjoyed that. I've whistled through it as best I can. There's an awful lot to cram in. If you've got any questions, I'll do my best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mick. That was really, really exciting, really interesting, and you know, we're talking about the heroic age, as you said. This was a man that was a genuinely, you say he was an unsung hero, but he was a genuine hero. Now we're going to hear next from Mike Robinson, who's also a fellow of this august institution. And Mike's been chief executive of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society since 2008, overseeing its move to Perth and rejuvenating its purpose, positioning and profile, and that of geography and geographers in Scottish civil society at the same time. Now, he has a particular interest, as many of us do, in sustainability and climate change. And this was recognised by being awarded in 2022 an honorary doctorate from the University of Stirling for all the work he's done in campaigning for the environment. So we're going to hear from you about all sorts of things, Mike, and we look forward to it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, I don't think you're going to hear about that many things, but because we're a bit short of time, so I'm going to be trying to do justice to 1 or 2 stories. I think what I'm hoping to do is really to celebrate Scotland's role in the polar age and the influence of Scots and individuals and organisations over that period, which is sort of still, that tradition is still being kept alive by the likes of Luke, who you're going to hear from next, and also by a lot of the Polar Academy people who are here tonight. So a real big welcome to them, and Craig, of course, who set that up. I think it's interesting, Tom Crean, obviously very much an overlooked character, but there is a lot of overlooked characters in the whole heroic age. And Scotland had a fair few of them. I think often, well, my experience of having been involved with the Royal Scottish Geographical Society for so long is often those people that we remember were either the best publicists or the ones who wrote the most books. You know, they tended to put themselves out there, and a lot of those that were a little bit more reticent often didn't got overlooked. So, really all I'm going to try and do, as I say, is celebrate Scotland's role in the polar age. And I'm going to start very quickly. Actually, one of the characters that seems, I think, worth mention is John Murray, who became Sir John Murray. He was the vice president of the RSGS, and he actually presented a paper in London in 1893, which was the renewal of Antarctic exploration. People felt that there'd been far too much death and tragedy around Franklin, and it's slightly been overlooked. His was very strongly a call for science. He had been heavily involved in the Challenger expedition, which was an enormous expedition, led to 20 years of research that required 20 years to digest the research from that expedition. And he gave this speech in London to the Royal Society, the Royal Geographical Society, that really helped to spark that whole enthusiasm for the heroic age. So he's a really important character in this. The one I'm going to try and concentrate on, but I'm going to struggle in 8 minutes, is William Speirs Bruce. He was based in Edinburgh. He originally born in London to a Scottish doctor. Moved up to Edinburgh. He was supposed to start university at the UCL doing a medical degree, but he got distracted by a summer school led by Patrick Geddes and J. Arthur Thompson. He came to that summer school, got very interested in all things oceanographic, transferred to Edinburgh, and actually then started working with John Murray on some of the findings of the Challenger in his spare time, and that slowly took over. He took a year out to take a trip down to the Antarctic on a whaling ship. He was hoping to take scientific samples because he was so awake to the scientific opportunities that the Antarctic represented. It wasn't deeply successful. The whalers weren't that keen on his involvement, and I don't think it achieved everything he'd hoped, but it definitely woke him up to the scientific possibilities of the South Pole. He had all sorts of jobs and various things to do. One of them was working as the taking weather forecasts on the top of Ben Nevis every day with a small team. So he was climbing Ben Nevis most days in all weather. And of course, through that, learnt a lot around meteorology. He was reporting into Alex Buchan, so another key character from that era. And he managed to get a position on the Jackson-Harmsworth expedition, where he bumped into Nansen, as the entire expedition did. They became lifelong friends, and he definitely became quite an inspiration. Speirs Bruce then blagged every trip he could to the Arctic. On one of those, he bumped into Prince Albert in Tromsø, and Prince Albert, who was one of the leading oceanographers, offered to take him on board and spend a couple of summers with him. So he then became really expert in all things oceanographic. Albert was definitely one of the leading lights of that period. And all of that expertise, that knowledge that he gleaned from all of these different expeditions, led him then to want to set up the Scotia expedition. Now, the Scotia really, I suppose, could be seen as running in competition to the Discovery. You'll know the dates of the Discovery were 1901, 1904. Speirs Bruce applied to be the scientific officer on the Discovery. He wrote what I think must have been a fairly compelling application. Two of his references were Fridtjof Nansen and Alex Buchan, and Prince Albert as well was another reference. So pretty remarkable set of references. But it wasn't really looked on very favorably, and he didn't really get an adequate response to the application. So he slightly upset people in London. He wrote to Clements Markham, who was the key man behind the Discovery, and said, actually, since you've been a while writing to me, I think I've got a better idea. I might try and fund a second ship and take that out and do all the science that I thought you should have been doing anyway. And I have to say, Clements Markham was not a very happy man. We have a wonderful letter in our archive expressing, in very passive-aggressive style, why he thought that was a really bad idea, and the RSGS should simply be helping fundraise for the Discovery. But one of the people that Speirs Bruce had spent time with in the Arctic was one of the Coates family. He had actually funded his own expedition, Major Andrew Coates, partly for shooting. But as a consequence, he made good friends with Bruce, and the Coates family and the RSGS stepped up and funded the Scotia expedition. So Bruce took an entirely Scottish crew. He was quite a fierce nationalist, and he was a bit put out now by London, so every single member of the crew was a Scot. His wife sewed him a lovely flag, the SNAE flag that he took with him. They landed on Laurie Island, named every part of the island after one of the crew, or their girlfriends, or the cat, or whatever, and established an oceanographic station, a weather station there, sorry, that has been the longest standing weather station with continual records ever since. So all of that went on. I haven't got much time to tell you about that, but exciting stuff. This is one of the main pictures that people will know. Gilbert Kerr with a slightly put-upon penguin. This is Omid House, which he named after one of the team that he'd been on Nevis with, which is the longest-standing weather station. The British didn't want it. He offered it to the British government. They turned it down, and so he offered it to the Argentinians, and they've been running it ever since. When this expedition returned, it was a little bit, he realized he wasn't getting some of the recognition he was hoping for, so he minted his own medal for the crew, which you can see at the top there. That's Gilbert Kerr's medal. But this is where the story takes a bit of a turn, because who organised the homecoming to Millport? Well, he was received by Sir John Murray, who was then president of the RSGS, and this guy was involved in organising the homecoming party. Shackleton had, by this stage, become the secretary to the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. And because I'm being very summary, my version of the story of Shackleton is often that it says, and then he went to Scotland, and then he did the Nimrod expedition. And it doesn't really talk about much what happened in Scotland. Well, it wasn't an accident that Shackleton came to Edinburgh to live for several years and took the role as secretary of RSGS. He could see somebody who'd managed to completely privately fund a separate expedition. He could see the networks that he'd made to do that, and he could sense an opportunity. And Shackleton was never shy of an opportunity. So he applied for the role of secretary. Again, quite an impressive CV. One of his references was Clements Markham, also Pelham Aldrich, who was the Vice Admiral of the Royal Navy. Very impressive CV. Does look like he cut and pasted bits out of somebody's letters. But even so. And he then also had to lobby for the role because the person he was up against had actually been on the crew of the Challenger and was a very close associate of Sir John Murray's. So there was a bit of a battle within board as to who took the role. Just to make you laugh, the one bit, if you can see in the bottom left of the CV, the front page, there's shorthand that we believe was taken during the interview. So we put it out to public, to ask the public to help us translate the shorthand. It's quite difficult to read shorthand. And we did get some help, but my favourite letter was a guy who wrote me a 4-page letter and said, it's not shorthand, it's Greek. And for 3.5 pages, he explained why it was Greek. And then the last line of the letter was, unfortunately, I don't speak a word of Greek. Not that helpful. Anyway, so there's Shackleton suddenly in there. And of course, what Shackleton's able to do in this role is he's inviting Amundsen to speak. He's just hosted Peary. He's actually talking to Bruce. He's made friends with William Speirs Bruce. He's totally at the heart of the whole of the network of the Scottish polar adventure. He's meeting Sir James Caird, who became famous because of a lifeboat named after him. He's meeting William Beardmore, who gave him a job and actually funded the Nimrod, largely, allegedly, because Shackleton had got too familiar with Lady Beardmore and he was hoping he wasn't coming home. But hence the Beardmore Glacier. So, but that whole era he was totally alive and awake to that. And of course, his story overlaps with Bruce's very significantly. Speirs Bruce, meanwhile, when he wasn't trying to digest all the science that he'd been doing, was also setting up a syndicate, trying to take people up to Spitsbergen, hoping to win resources and support and find resources up there that could turn into to support industry. He had a number of industry backers. This picture is from 1912, where he's standing on Advent Bay in Spitsbergen with Fridtjof Nansen and Nansen's son. So he ran a number of trips to the Arctic and continued to spend a lot of time in polar waters. In 1910, he presented a proposal to the RSGS for a new Scottish Antarctic expedition, one that crossed the continent. But he was struggling to win support for it. The problem is you don't just need to want to do the right science. You need the backers, you need a bit of establishment support, you need other bits to support you. You need profile. And Bruce was famously not interested in profile. He was really a pure scientist. So unfortunately, one of his mates, a guy called Ernest Shackleton, took it on instead. And you have heard about that expedition. So he's taken Bruce's plans, and they discussed it, and it was a very amicable relationship. But even when the Endurance got stuck in the ice and a relief committee was set up, Bruce was ignored, stating, myself, I suppose, because of being north of the Tweed, they think dead. So he was a wee bit he put out, it has to be said. Not that Bruce did not receive a lot of awards, he did. He got the RSGS Gold Medal, he also was recognised by the Royal Society of Edinburgh and many other societies, including the RGS and the American Geographical Society. But his big beef was he never got the Polar Medal, which is actually quite surprising for many reasons and still a source of contention to this day. He died in 1921. His last wish was his ashes were spread in the sea around South Georgia, which it says was honoured in principle. Not quite sure what that means. And in 1926, with the RSE and the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, we actually started the William Speirs Bruce Medal. And the first recipient in 1926 was James Manworthy himself, another overlooked figure from Stirling, who was a second in command on all of those trips to Spitsbergen with William Speirs Bruce. So that, I don't know if we've got time for this one. I'll try it. Are we good? Oh, it's got a lovely soundtrack as well. So, my conclusion is that Murray's legacy was opening up the whole heroic age, but he was also one of the founding fathers of oceanography. Shackleton's legacy was his leadership example, absolutely. Bruce's legacy was the Scotia. He also set up things like Edinburgh Zoo. I like to joke because he had too much of a taste for penguin, but he did do it before he went to the Antarctic. And he also set up the Scottish Ski Club. But ultimately, Bruce's legacy is his science, and it is definitely the most, apart from the Challenger, probably the most important scientific expedition of its age. And Scotland's polar legacy? Well, I don't think we make enough of that, but I'll leave you to decide. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mike, for that. Well, it's a taster, really, I think, over the kind of Scottish role in this and so on. Anyway, so we've heard from at least two or more explorers of the past, but now we're going to hear from the horse's mouth, as it were, from an explorer of the present. And Luke Robertson is obviously a Scottish polar explorer. And he's also an explorer in residence, I think, with the RSGS. So at the age, in 2016, aged just 30, he became the first Scot, the youngest Briton, and the first person with an artificial pacemaker to ski solo, unsupported, and unassisted to the South Pole. So that's 730 miles over 40 days, and an experience he described as leaving him with a feeling of being unbelievable and surreal. So, Luke, tell us all about how surreal it was and is. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for everyone coming along this evening. Two fascinating presentations there, I hope you'll agree, and if you find mine half as interesting, then I feel I've done a pretty good job. So just under 10 years ago, I remember waving goodbye to the two Twin Otter pilots as they dropped me off on the edge of Antarctica. And for me, that's the moment when everything felt very real and the scale of what I was hoping to achieve really hit home. My plan was to ski 730 miles, completely solo and unsupported over 40 continuous days, climbing from sea level up to 3,000 meters at the South Pole on the coldest, highest, driest continent on Earth. What on earth was I doing, and how was I going to get there? I remember fleeting between sheer terror and excitement at the same time. But physically, I actually felt pretty strong. I'd really enjoyed putting on the 7 to 10 kilograms of weight beforehand that I thought I'd needed to maintain my weight. And mentally, I'd had some of the best possible training I think anyone could ask for. And that's because 7 years previously, I'd been fitted with an artificial pacemaker for a heart condition. And then about 20 months before setting foot on Antarctica, I found myself here, recovering from a 5-hour craniotomy to remove most of a cyst from my brain. Now, the cyst had been diagnosed as a 12-centimeter brain tumor up until the operation itself, so a pretty fortunate outcome. And, you know, from both these experiences, there's a couple of things I found incredibly helpful. And the first was, after the initial shock, was coming to terms with where I was and accepting the situation as it was. There's nothing I could do to change it. It was about how I approached the situation from that moment forward and how I dealt with it. And the second thing was taking myself out of the moment and focusing on some vision, some goal I had in the future. And at that point, I already had this goal of skiing to the South Pole. And so that was really something I clung on to. And when I was in the Western Infirmary in Edinburgh here, and I would watch the sun above the Pentland Hills to the south of Edinburgh, and I would imagine that same sun guiding me to the South Pole in Antarctica. And little did I know these experiences would be some of the best practice I could ever have for some situations out there on the ice. So feeling pretty good physically and pretty well prepared mentally, my biggest concern was I completely uninsurable? But my fears and doubts were completely unfounded, because when I spoke to the American insurance company, and I told them about some minor health conditions. They were very happy to insure me for a fee, and I realized their biggest concern was, could they upsell me? Mr. Robertson, would you like to hire a car for your holiday to Antarctica? So as I stood here on the busiest highway on Antarctica, I remember thinking, I'm going to need this sun, its comfort, its presence, to help guide me and to help fulfill this vision I'd had from the hospital bed, and ski to the South Pole, and I took the first few steps. But the first few steps were pretty tough. When you're skiing from the very coast of Antarctica, it's uphill from the start, and quite sharply uphill at the start. There are crevasses around that area to navigate. And when I was carrying a sledge at that point at its heaviest, about the weight of 6 fully laden suitcases. And also 2014 to 16 was the strongest El Nino year on record, and still is. So on the coast, a lot of precipitation fell, as it does in Antarctica, as snow. So for the first few days, my view from the tent was something like this.
Antarctica.
So all of this meant that the start was very, very tough. So pulling that heavy sledge, uphill, maximum weight, acclimatizing to the conditions. And it meant that I was eating into my emergency food ration bags much earlier than I'd anticipated. So I had 40 days of standard food bags filled with all sorts of goodies you can see there, and 6 to 7 ration bags that I intended using at the very end of the expedition if I really needed them or something had gone wrong to rely on. And every single bag that you see there, my then fiance, also RSGS Explorer in residence, and now wife Hazel, who's here tonight, had written a personal note in every single one, handwritten, brought tears to my eyes every time I opened it. And for the emergency ration bags, 6 to 7, she'd written really personal messages, thinking, of course, that I would be using these bags at the very, very end of the trip. So about 7 miles into a 730-mile expedition, getting notes such as, you're almost there, you can do it, reach out and touch the pole, brought a very different tear to my eye than was intended at that point. But a much more serious situation occurred about a week later, when the batteries that charge my satellite phone, my satellite texting device, and my phone that I use for music at that point during some of the tougher days failed. So I'd used them in Norway and Greenland, and they'd been fine, but that precipitation that had fallen as snow in Antarctica, and it was so warm at the start, it had turned into water and had somehow got into my batteries, so my solar panels didn't work. Now luckily and also tactically, I'd managed to charge all my equipment fully in case something like this happened, but it was still a real concern and a real issue. And the logistics team told me that if I didn't make my daily check-in once, at least in 48 hours, they would send a plane to come and get me because they couldn't risk that something had gone wrong. And that would be the end of the expedition. No questions asked, they would come and pick me up. And also meant that I couldn't have those kind of once in 3 days comfort calls with Hazel that I think we both would have appreciated. But at the same time, that experience kind of brought a bit more focus, if that was possible, to the expedition. I knew I couldn't make any more or any mistakes whatsoever, so I became much more focused. And after the initial frustration and kind of kicking myself for what had happened, using that acceptance of what had happened and moving through that, just as I had done in hospital, was particularly useful. And I also realized that this experience had brought my expedition a little bit, just a little bit, more in line with the polar explorers of 100 years ago who didn't have any outside communication whatsoever. And I started to think about the differences and the similarities between some of our trips. And solo travel in Antarctica has really only been made possible over the last 30 to 40 years because of huge improvements in everything from how you get to Antarctica, to the logistics that are there, to the rescue operations that can take place, to the lightweight tent, the lightweight sledges, the better food, freeze-dried food, everything like that. And I remember seeing photos of explorers, like Mick has just shown here, with these heavy clothes, these huge gloves. And and just being very grateful for the advances that have taken place to help me be where I was that day. But what was more interesting to me when I was out there with nothing to listen to other than my squeaky ski was thinking about some of the similarities between my experience and those that had gone before me around 100 years ago. And for me, getting out of the tent was so hard some mornings. And I think that's something that existed 100 years ago. When you're waking up from the relative warmth of your sleeping bag and you can hear the wind whistling, shaking your tent, you can feel the snow building up outside, and you know there is no option but to go outside and face it. And I think aptly Cherry Garrard, who was part of Scott's Terra Nova expedition, summed it up quite well when he said, "We lay in our bags, each waiting for the other to say that it was time to get up. There would be long silences broken only by the noise of the wind outside, while each of us pretended to be asleep, hoping that someone else would make the move. At last, one would give in and say, well, I suppose we had better get up. That was the signal. There was nothing more to be said, and we would begin the struggle." Now, I had no one else to do that to, so that was a real issue some mornings in particular. And then there was the effect of the sun on my kind of mental state. So the days when the sun was shining, progress was so much easier. You could kind of guide yourself with the shadows in the snow. Everything just felt so much easier, resting on your pulk for those breaks. And the endless days of storms where you feel like you're skiing through a ping pong ball, slow progress, wondering if you would ever make it at all. And Shackleton summed up this really well when he talked about the effect of the weather on his men being much greater than rations, increasing rations, when he said the effect of the weather on our mental state was very marked. All hands felt much more cheerful on a bright sunny day and looked forward with much more hope to the future than when it was dull and overcast. This had a much greater effect than an increase in rations. And then there was the sheer effect of the cold. So this was minus 47 with wind chill. And Antarctica, it's just always cold. Like, there's no getting away from it. It's always cold. But as you ski closer to the pole, you have these katabatic winds coming down from the high point of the South Pole all the way down to the coast, meaning you're always facing a headwind. So as you get closer to the pole and it becomes colder and colder, any exposure to your hands, to your nose, to anywhere, whether you're changing from your skiing gloves to your gloves for putting up your tent and for cooking with, to going to the toilet, have to be done as quickly and effectively as possible, because the threat of frostbite is there as it is nowadays, as it was 100 years ago. And then there were the hallucinations. So hallucinations are talked about in most accounts of polar travel, especially in Antarctica. And for me, they started off quite innocently. I would imagine myself in a supermarket with all these delicious food items on either side, and I would be skiing down, imagining picking them off and putting them in my sledge, which helped at that point. And then things took a bit of a strange turn, and I would see cartoon characters like the Flintstones appearing behind these, the sastrugi, which are these kind of windswept ice formations on Antarctica. And then later on, even more bizarre, I would hear someone calling my name behind me. And every time I would hear it, I would turn around and there would be no one there. And then closer to the pole in the last 50, 60 miles, I would hear someone, almost see someone in front of me guiding me forward. And I had no idea what any of this meant. And a friend who's a psychologist who's written a book on presence told me that it's really, at points, it's the brain creating images of what you need at that time. So there's the food. I was so hungry at certain points on that expedition. And then, of course, I needed the company. I needed someone to guide me forward. But if anyone can explain why the Flintstones were there, then please, you can write a book about it and probably make quite a lot of money. But really, the combined challenges of the hallucinations, the struggles just to get out of the tent some days, the cold conditions, the hunger, meant that with about 50 miles to go, I'd almost finished my ration bags, although I still had the notes, which were more important. And I knew that I needed to try and complete the last 50 miles in one full stretch without sleep. So I set off in great weather, and apart from a slight mishap where I left my GPS behind and had to ski back 3 miles and then back to get it, conditions were good, exhausted, but I was making progress. And then with about 5 to 10 miles to go, I could see some structure ahead. And I thought, that must be the South Pole Station. And I could see lights flashing on and off, and I thought, this must be the runway that's on the ice there as well. I must be close. And then Antarctica had one final surprise for me. A huge snowstorm came in. So it was head down, compass out in front of me, and just plodding on, knowing it must be close. And as I got closer, I was waiting for these huge metal structures to come towards me. And to this day, I saw them. And I'm not entirely sure whether I skied straight under the Scot Amundsen station, but it must have been pretty close. And then I saw flags all around me in the snow, knowing I must be quite close. And little did I know afterwards that I'd skied straight through the ceremonial South Pole and out the other end, and had started heading north again, which, adding miles to this trip, was not something I needed. But as you can see here, eventually the sun cleared, and I made my way back to the South Pole. But it's almost impossible to compare the perils of the journeys of 100 years ago with what I went through. The cramped, cold, dark conditions, the months, years without communication, and that's just to get to Antarctica before even setting foot on the ice. The complete lack of rescue, the poor diets, the penguin eggs, the seal meat, everything that Mick has described previously with my own experience, they're completely incomparable. But when I try to find some common thread that I think has existed over time and includes this modern age of polar exploration, there's one thing that kind of comes to mind for me, and it's why explorers and some scientists find ourselves in these regions. And I think it comes down to a common willingness to follow up on an insatiable personal curiosity. And most importantly, to act on it, to trust it, and to be at least okay with the vulnerability and the uncertainty that it brings, particularly when you're in polar environments. And Apsley Cherry Garrard, again, who was on Scott's Terra Nova expedition, has a good quote. And he said, exploration is the physical expression of the intellectual passion. And I tell you, if you have the desire for knowledge and the power to give it physical expression, go out and explore. And I would just add to that, make sure you have a good rest afterwards. And I think the description of exploration there applies, in its broadest sense, because that thirst for curiosity, for knowledge, for interest exists within all of us. It's the reason why people are here tonight and joining online as well. And it's really just about finding something that lights each of us up as much as polar travel, polar history lights up polar historians or polar explorers. And on reflection, for years, I feel like I'd left that behind, that interest, that passion, that curiosity I'd had as a kid and as a teenager for exploring and for adventures on the farm I grew up in northeast Scotland. And it really, as a kid with a very cool jumper, I should add. And it wasn't really until questioning the route I was taking through life in my mid to late 20s that I started to lean more into that, into what really set me off and what really interested me as a kid. And I rediscovered a spark that led to this expedition, to me being here tonight, and has led to so much more than I could ever have imagined. And I see it now myself in my 2-year-old. His curiosity is limitless. His imagination is endless. And to him, anything is possible. And I think for me, I see part of my role is helping him hold on to that as much as I possibly can. Because explorers, to me, are a bit like kids with big dreams who just refuse to let them go and often take people along on the journey with them. So, for example, Craig Matheson, who's here tonight. Craig, could you pop up your hand? So Craig set out in 2004 on the first Scottish dedicated expedition to the South Pole. And when Craig's an RSGS Explorer in residence as well. And when he was out there, he was inspired by a fellow adventurer, and he returned and set up a charity called the Polar Academy that takes children on a year-long transformational journey, ending with them leading expeditions in Greenland. And that change that you see in those kids is unbelievable. And the impact and the ripple effect it has is well beyond Craig. And then there are other polar explorers, Anne Bancroft, Felicity Aston, Preet Chandy, who use their polar travels for advocacy, education, and mentoring. So really, I think, and also if supporters from my own expedition, if I'd known they were going to raise £100,000 for Marie Curie, then I wouldn't have believed that at the start of this whole journey. So I think it's thinking about what lights you up as much as polar exploration lights me and others up. And it doesn't matter your age. It can be a new adventure. It could be a new business, a new project. It could be leading a charity like Mike. It could be writing a book like Mick. And it really doesn't matter if you don't know how. I had no idea how to ski to the South Pole. Sorry, that's the Polar Academy there. I had no idea how to ski to the South Pole, any idea of polar survival or exploration before I set out on this journey. It's really just about letting that curiosity fire up your imagination and stepping towards it, because you'll figure it out on the way. And Einstein had a great quote. He said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world." And for me, in other words, logic will get you from A to B for sure, but imagination will take you anywhere. And I think that's true whether you're a kid with a big dream, you're lying on a hospital bed, or you're standing on the edge of a frozen continent, or even sitting here tonight. Thank you.
Wow. Well, oh yeah, that's me. Thank you. Yeah, how does that happen? Hey, Luke, thank you very much. That was absolutely, well, first of all, it was very funny. It was also hallucinatory in some ways. We lived that. We had a real trip, man. And it was inspirational, I think, is absolutely inspiring. And I'm so glad that you ended with the, as it were, all three of you actually, I think, have made us all curious, which is very fitting on this, at the start of this particular program. And indeed, it makes one insatiably curious about exploration and about what it entails, what's happened, and all these unsung and unknown heroes that have that did this all over the years, and including now in the 21st century. So thank you very much. Now I'm going to ask our three speakers to come up and join me up here on the stage, and we'll go for the Q&A. Now, just to let you know that there are two of our colleagues, so anybody who's got a question, just raise your hand. You don't have to say who you are unless you really want to. And then we'll just sort of ask for a couple of questions. I think we'll just go. I was going to ask a couple of questions, but I won't, because we don't have much time left. So can Ram, has he put this on? Sorry. Fine. Yeah, I hope you hear me fine. Anyway, so who would like to ask the first question of our three panels? Okay. All right. Anybody? Well, can I ask then? Sorry. Just, hand up. There is somebody. So, yes, please do.
Question for Luke.
Yes, Harry, wait for the mic, please. Yeah.
Luke, Professor Robert Swan, who you probably are aware has been down to that part of the world and speaks quite a lot about it. He talks about the physical changes that he suffered in terms of his eyes changing colour when he came back. I just wondered if you came back with physical, emotional, enduring changes that affect you today.
Depends how long you have. Physical is probably a little bit easier. I came back with frostnip verging on frostbite, particularly on my nose. You might see a little white spot there on my fingers, and I had some rather large lesions on my legs. But as you said, they're temporary. They last a short amount of time, and I think the changes in myself have lasted much longer. I would sum it up as much greater confidence in my own abilities. And that isn't to do with polar exploration, I think, and just in terms of realizing that as someone who maybe started off with a lot less confidence. It brought an awareness that I could do things, tackle things, start new things, and be okay being uncomfortable with the uncertainty that doing anything new can bring. So it led to a career change, to working in sort of climate and nature, led to more expeditions, which, on reflection, before Antarctica felt terrifying. And after that, it just felt like a natural progression because you built up those skills. And it was kind of the point I was kind of making at the start is you don't have to know things. It can be really scary to start something new or to do something new. But as you go through the process and you take those steps, you can get to amazing places and just by starting off small. And that whole trip gave me the confidence just to bypass some of those small steps in future trips or future changes and just kind of go all in and know that I would work it out somehow as long as it was something I was passionate about. So that's the biggest skill I've learned beyond the polar skills or anything like that. They drift and come back depending on where I've been, but it's the confidence that I gained in myself, which has lasted, and that's linked to the work that Craig does with the Polar Academy, the changes in the kids that you see after their expedition and during the training as well. It's not about the trip itself, it's about the lasting changes that you see in yourself. Much more important. Thank you.
Can I ask you talked a lot about some of the similarities, but how would you say have things changed? What are the differences between then and now, would you say? And I'd like to hear from you two as well.
Yeah, well, please go first. And
Mike?
Well, I don't know, thinking about that whole age,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that John Murray's intervention did actually was help to sort of tap a zeitgeist. It brought a national ambition, a national interest, a national shared direction that for some reason it just caught the zeitgeist. So it brought the whole of the scientific community behind it because of just a general joy and desire for new science and new discovery. But that isn't enough. That's never enough, actually. It is enough for some people, but it isn't enough to achieve more. It's not enough to sort of move society. So you've got to do more than that. And I think what it also did was it sort of tapped, probably an industrial, to be honest, a national desire to look for new resources or seek new opportunities as well. And it also caught that public imagination. And I think that's what was quite unusual about that age. It sort of cut across all of these different spheres and different sectors and brought people behind a shared vision, a shared challenge. And actually, I think that's more difficult at the moment. I think it's very difficult to, there's more people doing different things. It's harder to get that sense of unity, I think, across spaces. But actually, ironically, I think it's really, really important and really necessary. And so, my day-to-day, my biggest thing is spending time worrying about climate change. And actually, to me, it's not the issue about how awful it is. It's the possibilities in solving it that can galvanize all sorts of people around that shared, ambition. And I think actually that's a really positive space. And I think that's sort of what came out of this early exploration era for me, and is still very possible.
Oh, that's really interesting. Nick, what would you say? Because,
Well,
has space taken over now?
It's sort of. I think it is worth, again, putting it into the historic context. The 19th century overall was an age of exploration. All countries were at it. Even the Americans, who've never been a great colonial power, but even they were expanding. The British Empire doubled in size in the 19th century because they went everywhere looking for new land, and this was the way the world worked. The French were looking at it, the Germans were looking at it, certainly the Scandinavians were looking at it, and around the time that Mike's talking about here with Murray, the world talked about the three poles: the North Pole, the South Pole, and Mount Everest. These were the three great unattained goals for mankind, or humankind, I should say, of that era. And so this coincided, the Challenger expedition, which you mentioned in the 1870s, was a massive scientific program, really. They didn't actually, I don't think they even crossed the Antarctic Circle, if I remember correctly. So it wasn't even about Antarctica. But the whole thrust of exploration was towards the end of the 19th century. It was because everybody else was at it. And some were on a very low key, some were relatively small. The Scotia expedition is a relatively small number of people, compared to Discovery. The Discovery had 60 people set out. They didn't all go, but by the time they got to the Antarctic, there were around about 50 people involved. So these were really big enterprises, and it was all about new frontiers.
I think some of the changes I would comment on are, I think, looking at from an explorer's point of view, is the people that are going out there now represent a much broader spectrum of society, nationalities, ethnicities, which I think can only be a good thing. People associate with people they see themselves in, and so if you have the first from another country, skiing to the South Pole, that brings that awareness, that ripple effect of interest in Antarctica, which of course is strongly linked to climate change nowadays. So I think that can only be a good thing. And I think perhaps the age of discovery has changed more away from discovery of place, because the world is very well mapped nowadays, to discovery of change. So it's mapping the changes that we're seeing rather than place. I think that's a key thing, and that's linked to the science as well. And then Antarctica and the polar regions are much more accessible than they were, and that's for various reasons. And again, there are some drawbacks to that, of course, and we should all be very conscious of emissions and sources of emissions. But at the same time, people connect with what they see or what they visit. And so if you have, you can go and explore somewhere or see someone else exploring and you connect with that person, it draws that interest. And over time, you hope that it has a ripple effect of more people caring about that place. And so I'm quite hopeful for that as well. So I think there are changes, but of course there are, science will always be present. I think Mike and Mick hopefully would agree, although I defer to your much greater knowledge of polar history, that with some of these protagonists, science was very much secondary. But it was always there in the background. There were some fantastic scientific expeditions, Speirs, Bruce, both Shackleton and Scott took scientists with them. And science will always be there. And so that's something I think that has continued through time.
It's just one point to add to that. One forget that Shackleton had absolutely no interest whatsoever in science, none whatsoever. Yet 4 of the men that he took to the Antarctic with him were later knighted for their services to science. So he knew how to pick people. That was brilliant.
I don't think that's changed. I mean, I'd see explorers today who still sort of append science sometimes to what they're doing. That's maybe not their primary purpose, but I do think that was actually partly Bruce's influence, because
it was, yeah.
Bruce didn't care about planting flags, doing anything like that. He just wanted to do new science. So, but I agree with Luke. A big part of the change, I think, is that we were sort of going out and mapping new things and new discoveries, and now we seem to be mapping our impact more than anything else. Yeah. So yeah, it has changed in that sense.
There is also, I think, something we overlook, but exploration in historical terms was part of the popular culture in the 19th century. More people could read and write towards the end of the 19th century. You had an explosion of popular magazines. Books were being published about these expeditions, such as the Arctic expedition, not so much the Antarctic, because there hadn't been many at that point, but certainly the world was getting their first view of the wildlife of the Arctic, of the Inuit people. They had never seen these images before, and they were suddenly being brought back. And I've written a book about Shackleton, and I just remember from his young days, he was absolutely captivated by the stories of these adventure stories of the Arctic. Roald Amundsen, the greatest of all polar explorers, grew up reading about the Franklin expedition. So it was in their popular culture, and I think we sometimes overlook that. It was what people read all the time, and increasingly as education improved.
Yes, please. Yeah, you, sir. You, yes, you. Sorry, wait for the mic. Yeah.
One of the biggest changes I observed in the polar regions, Antarctica in particular, the biggest change
is that Antarctica is no longer isolated. Right up until, well, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, well into the 2000s, you were very isolated communication-wise. And the British experience, and it may vary country to country, was that we would get 200 words in and 100 words out spoken over the radio per month. And that's families at home, they would hear from you once a month, that was it. Since then, you do email from the tent. And back in 2022, my most recent season there, I was working with Italian geologists, deep field, and the Italian geologist I was working with got really unhappy if every night he couldn't speak to and see on his laptop his children at home in Italy. So logistically also, it's very easy to get there now. If you've got the money, it's simple. It's becoming a playground. It's no longer the isolated continent it used to be. That's a big, big change.
Would you agree with that?
Mick has someone joining tonight online from...
Well, as far as I know, I can't see from here, but a friend of mine is actually overwintering at Scot Base at the moment, and he's apparently watching us. So, hi, Peter, if you are watching.
Any other questions? Yeah, yes, there's an online question, yeah.
Yep. So we've got quite a big online audience, and we've got one from Derek in Dumfries who says, are there still areas of Antarctica to be explored, or is the South Pole still the aim for most explorers?
You're the man.
I think there's sort of two different answers for that. It depends on your purpose, I think. As has been alluded to, you know, the 3 summits. I was talking to an explorer, shouldn't really say this probably, never mind, who was saying that he'd sort of done the 7 summits and the Explorers Grand Slam, that was right. And said he was the first explorer to do the Explorers Grand Slam. And actually then it turned out he'd invented the Explorers Grand Slam. So, you know, different people have different aspirations. Clearly there are, you know, it's like with climbing, there's certain summits people want to do, certain points they want to get to. I think that the nature of that has changed, the challenge of that has changed. I agree with Luke, there's a real role in exploration personally in terms of how it impacts you and your confidence and your self-awareness and self-belief. I think those things are really important, but they're not scientifically helpful. But I still think there's plenty of science to be done, and there's still plenty of science being done in the Antarctic. But no, not much of it is to do with whether you've got to the South Pole or not, no.
Okay. Sorry, there's a question here, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd second the comment that was made by the other gentleman over there about the change in communications. When I first went to Antarctica, well, we couldn't even get whizzes off with 200 words. And we were obviously in the deep field in ventile clothing with big snot wiper gloves and things like that. But the other thing that I think is of interest was just brought up then, and that's about the scientific endeavour. I'm a geologist, and yes, I can say there are places that have never been visited. Certainly my side of Antarctica in Edinburgh land, there's 100 mountains that have never been visited. We know where they are, they've been flown over, but no one's landed on them or investigated them. And it's true even on the coastline in some of the areas that I've worked over the last 40 years. So there's still opportunities to discover new things, although we've got it mostly sorted, but there's a lot of new things that can still be discovered. And if you go inland to places like the southern Prince Charles Mountains, huge areas there that have only ever been set foot on once from a helicopter, for example. So it's a great opportunity. There's still plenty of things to do, plenty of things to see and learn and discover.
Any more? Yes, sir. There's a couple of questions. Anna, yeah. We'll take the 2 together.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen, for 3 excellent talks. Thank you. I've been very fortunate as a young child to had books which were Nansen's Furthest North, which I used to read regularly, and also the fortunate thing to be in New Zealand, where Scott left from Port Livingston. These are stories of determination and resilience, and yours in particular. This is the one problem we seem to have in Scotland now, or elsewhere, developed a society where children are so protected that they no longer know how to go to school at the age of 6, walk alone, unprotected, take risks, and learn from them. How do you think we can actually change our Scottish education so that we can actually do these things and learn from it and learn imagination again and curiosity?
Pretty amazing. Well, I mean, I think
taking both questions.
Shall we ask this? Yeah, thank you. We don't have much longer.
You want the other question?
Aye.
We're at a curious conference here, and I would divide the curious tourists from the curious scientists going to Antarctica, and I would ask the panel, are we doing enough to protect Antarctica in its pristine state? Thank you.
Right. Are we doing enough to protect Antarctica in its pristine state?
I'll have a go. Both the difficult questions. The first on curiosity, when you come into our office, the first quote you'll see is Freya Stark's, that curiosity is the one thing invincible in nature. And I have to remind myself of that. I always believed that to be true. I suddenly realized, I think more recently, that not everybody is curious, but most of us are. And I think we're born curious. So I think it's probably about how do you maintain that spark of curiosity and encourage and nurture that spark of curiosity. And I think that is a difficult thing to do. But I do think actually, in a way, one of the things that we have understood, and I've understood through my role, I'm very lucky that on one level, my organization is a repository of some of the best stories of the last 150 years. And so we constantly bump into things or find things in the archive that remind us of different stories that I do think probably have been forgotten. And so a silly example, but I wrote out to the members, I was looking for a bit of reassurance that we'd been doing decent things in the last 10 years. And I said, can you write in and tell me the talks that you particularly remember and that have sort of stayed with you? And the only letters I got were all the talks was 70 years ago. But they were talks by Herman Bull, the first man to climb Nanga Parbat, who held up his hand to the audience with his finger missing because he'd had to saw it off because he got frostbite. And, you know, these sorts of things. And so these stories, I know they're extreme and it's very easy to separate them from the science in some ways. I'll come back to that if I remember. But the fundamental point is that inspiration like this lasts a lifetime. These stories stay with you. People are still here talking about Shackleton. They're still here talking about Nansen and Amundsen. All these people, these are some of the extreme examples, but everybody's, you know, what appeals to you, what, you know, affects you is very different. What inspires you is very personal. And you never know what that is going to be. But I do think it's really important, actually, that we are better at keeping these stories alive and sharing them, because I do believe that inspiration lasts your entire life. And so I do think that actually is partly the answer, perhaps. There's huge pressure on education. How you would necessarily fit that within the education curriculum is a difficult thing to say. But
what do you think, Luke? Because you're the father of a 2-year-old, and there's another. You tell me there's another child on the way. So what would you want the educational system to do for your?
That's a very good question. I think if people stopped reading the news quite so much, they'd perhaps stop being scared of the world. But I think...
2 old hacks.
Yeah, I haven't been in the education system for about 20 years, so it's quite difficult to say. But I think it's I don't really know, to be honest. I think down to the parents' preference, I think.
Right.
And you have to think quite deeply and quite intricately about the short-term benefits versus the longer-term impact it can have on your kids. So take the Polar Academy, for example. I would imagine most parents that are sending their kids off to Greenland on an expedition are probably quite terrified at the start of that prospect. And then they see the kids come back from that experience as changed people. And I think it's a great exemplar of what is possible if we allow our kids to take a bit more of a risk and be kids and be okay exploring and being curious. It's very easy to want to protect them. Then you have to question, what are you protecting them for in the future?
I mean, there are some young people in the audience. So
Yeah.
Any of you prepared to say whether the educational system that you've grown up in, been brought up in, has done enough to spur your own curiosity and your own imagination?
It's a hard question.
If it helps in any way, I do. I mean, I'm hopelessly ill-equipped to talk about the Scottish education system, as you can tell from my accent. I'm not from round here, but
Doesn't matter.
but I do quite a lot of talks in schools on this general subject. And for example, the story of Tom Crean is now on the curriculum in Irish schools. So I get invited across all the time. And there's a very clear pattern. I've been doing this on and off for about 20 years. A very clear pattern has emerged, is the kids are absolutely fascinated with these stories. They are gripped. You can, honestly, you really can hear a pin drop, even amongst I've given talks to 400 children from about 10 different schools in a cinema once, and the teachers were shaking their heads in disbelief. As soon as you start, they are absolutely captivated. And the other characteristic which I've noticed since I started doing it is, and I don't mean this in any way to be sexist, is how much the women, or the girls as they are, have taken an interest in it. I get invited, for example, all the time to go to all girls' schools to talk about it. You wouldn't have thought it would be, a bloke with a beard and a woolly hat and a pipe. It's hardly sort of the material you'd think that would appeal to young girls. Absolutely not at all. The level of interest that comes from the schools, I have to turn down invitations. And as I said, one of the main characteristics is how involved the girls are. And that's just a feedback. I mean, I'm not sure whether that tells you anything about the subject.
So maybe we can have an all-female Scottish polo expedition.
Well, they are undoubtedly, they're interested in the history. That's it. And of the endeavour that these men did.
Hannah?
I think that just ties nicely into a question that we've had from online, which actually says most famous polo explorers, or those that we've looked at tonight and that you see in the media, often are men. And are there any notable women who are polar explorers, and when did they first set foot on Antarctica?
I can help with a few dates. The first woman to go to the Antarctic, i.e. land on the mainland, not on one of the islands, was 1935. So it's actually not that long ago. The first women to go to the South Pole actually went by aeroplane, and what I think is actually a very symbolic act. There were 6 of them. They were American scientists, and they walked down the plane arm in arm so that nobody could say who was first, which I thought was rather nice.
I mean, one story that is worth highlighting is Myrtle Simpson, who was spent a lot of time in the Arctic. She's still lives in Kincraig, real character, but took her children, very young children, to the Arctic and lived on ice floes and various other things. Very different to idea of risk, as we were touching on earlier. And again, I think it sort of plays into that idea that I think the reason that some of these stories, there's lots of fantastic women who've done lots of these things, but I do think we need to keep these stories alive, because that, one of the things I think we've lost sight of is taking risks. I think that's something we're not that comfortable with. And actually, when you realise that there are nutters like Myrtle out there and Luke and people like that, it actually emboldens people in the more day-to-day lives, I think. And it also, if you actually start to take risks, it emboldens you and gives you that self-belief that I think is very easy to lose sight of in just normal activity. So that's why I think it's important that we do actually celebrate all of these figures for all these reasons, because these stories are so extreme often that it does make you feel an awful lot better about your own life when something's not quite where it should be.
Right.
And also, I think it's about normalising some of the risk taking. It's about making sure these kids know that it's actually okay to do some very unusual things, and that it's okay, because we're, again, as the person asked the question pointed out, we're become quite a risk-averse society, and you've got to question the long-term impact of that on kids' own confidence, on their ability to take on challenges, the resilience aspect as well. And so by learning about some of the polar explorers or about their peers through the Polar Academy, it has that ripple effect more broadly. So, and I would also just add to that, although the better known stories are of the polar explorers, you can almost, the best known stories are the ones from longest ago. But there are some incredible women polar explorers nowadays. I mentioned some in my talk: Preet Chandy, Felicity Aston, Anne Bancroft. And just because they're not well known doesn't mean their endeavours aren't as incredible. And if you were to look at the polar explorers who set out every year, there aren't many of them that do trips to the South Pole or beyond. But it's quite a split now. It's not like it was 30 years ago, 100% men, 0% women. It's quite a split now. So if you have a look at the last few years, you'll see it's very much equaled out. It's just the better known ones and the better known stories are the ones that people hear about the most, and so that's why people necessarily think that it's exclusively a male expedition environment when it's not that at all.
Well, yes. Sorry, you've already asked something. Can I very briefly? Very brief.
You spoke about your struggles with your health before you went on before you went on your expedition. What advice would you give to somebody who is struggling with their health and wanting to go on an expedition?
Don't use it as an escape from what you're going through. It's a great question. So don't use it as an escape. It's really important to acknowledge what you're going through and find acceptance in that first. But for sure, use that kind of feel or that wanting to improve your condition as the fuel. And I think focusing on a vision into the future as well can really help take you out of the situation a little bit as well. It can help remove you, because if you are going through something like that, whether it's physical or mental health issues, it can feel quite all-encompassing. But having something else to kind of remove you from the situation whilst acknowledging what you're going through can be quite powerful, something else to focus on as well. But happy to talk about it in a bit more detail afterwards if it's useful.
Very last question.
You said from the question earlier where you asked some of us what our opinions were on the school system and what it does for our curiosity. I think the school system these days is designed to make us be afraid of failure, which squanders our curiosity. Especially when you reach high school. I'm in my 6th year of high school currently, and you start to be afraid of taking risks, being curious about things that may not be normal in the typical sense. You start trying to fit in. Every test you do seems to be an estimate of how good you are as a person, and just because maybe you're not so great at maths or English doesn't mean you're not curious or not good at something. Everyone has a passion and a talent. And I feel that schools don't act on those enough, that they care more about how good you are mentally than what you're actually curious about.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think that just shows that.
Well said.
Someone much more qualified to answer that question.
Yeah, well, that's what,
I
I think it sums up the kind of the whole purpose of this evening in a sense as well. And any last words?
I think that's right. I think there is, interestingly, there's names of organisations that have popped up that are celebrating failure because it's seen as a sort of missing in the way that we're allowing people to explore. You have to explore yourself, don't you? You have to explore your own world and how you fit into it, and there's no right way to do that. And if you're afraid of failing all the time, you're not really going to explore that. So I do think failure, we should celebrate failure. Let's be honest, Shackleton didn't really achieve a huge amount, to be honest, but he did it really well. And the other thing I'm a big
Bob Dylan song, isn't it? Failures, those.
And the other thing I'm a big fan of is boredom. I have 3 children. I wrote an essay when they were younger that I thought you needed to allow children to be bored, because actually, in a way, that creates curiosity and creativity. And if you just constantly pushing people to be doing the next thing, I just don't think they get the space to explore and take risks.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Luke.
I would just add to that point about failure is Hazel and I, after the Antarctic expedition, set out on a human-powered expedition from south of Alaska to the very north using only human power, and we didn't achieve what we set out to do. And from my perspective, having gone through the education system, that failure, what I perceived that failure at the end, was so overpowering, and it took days, if not weeks, to get over it. And we were able to. I was able to reframe it, and now it feels so insignificant because of everything that the journey taught me. But at that point, as you said, and I'm sure in many ways it's because I was conditioned like that to think about if you don't get an A or a B, then you're a failure. If you don't achieve what you set out to do, then you're a failure. But I promise you, when you get out of school, the world's a very different place. And I wish you every luck with that. But even that awareness you have of how it has affected you and perhaps some of your peers, I think will stand you in great stead in the future.
Well, can I thank the three panelists, our three speakers, Nick, Mike, and Luke, for actually raising a huge amount of curiosity and then for broadening the whole discussion out. And we've ended up having a really interesting conversation about all sorts of things. And I also thank the audience, and particularly you young people as well, for the questions that you asked. And to everybody who's turned up this evening, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it makes you want to go and explore far more, including throughout the next, is it 10 days, Hannah? The next 10 days when the Curious program is on, and you can sign up. You don't have to come here all the time. You can do it online as well. So anyway, thank you all very much, and I wish you a safe journey home. Thank you.